to get started, in the routes folder, in the portal route, we'll create a new route called products.tsx. And we're going to use this route to practice search parameters. Now, to get to this route, in the components folder, we'll open the portal menu file. And here we'll add a link to the products route. So let's just duplicate the to-dos nav item. And then change the to prop to portal/products. And the to-dos label to products. All right, now let's open the browser. And in the portal route, we should now see a products link. So let's click on it, and it should open the products route. Now let's say we have a list of products here, and we want to search for specific items using a query. And for that, we can use a search parameter. To do that, in the URL, we add a query string using a question mark, and then we pass the key of the search parameter. And let's just go with query. And then we pass it a string as value. Now, the string can be in double quotes. However, it's not required. We can also pass it directly. And let's just go for keyboard. All right, now what happens under the hood is TanStack Router reads the query string and parses it into a JavaScript object. And we can then access that object, for example, in our route component. So let's just do that in VS Code. Let's open the products route. And in the route component, we'll use the route object and call its use search hook. And this returns an object with all the search parameters that are currently used on this route. So we'll store it in a constant called search params. Now, instead of this div, let's render the search params object. And to do that, we'll create a pre-formatted text element. And inside it, we add a pair of curly braces with search params. And now we get an error because we can't render an object directly. So to fix that, we will use the JSON object, call its stringify method, and pass it the search params object. And this basically converts the object into a string. Now save the changes and open the browser. And if everything is done correctly, we should see an object with a key and value of our search parameter. And then we could use the search parameter, for example, to search for keyboard. All right, now we can also use multiple search parameters if we want. And to do that, in the URL, we'll add an ampersand followed by the next search parameter, for example, color, which we set to black. Again, TanStack Router reads the query string and parses it into a search params object, and this time it also has color. Now, while experimenting with search parameters, we can just type them in the URL as we're doing now, but that can get really complicated, and there's actually an easier way. So in VS Code, let's open portal menu, and in the link component, we will use the search property and pass it a search object. And here we can define all the search parameters. Now, to add a search parameter, we just pass the key, which is query. And then we set it to the string keyboard. Now save the changes to reformat the file. All right, let's also add color and set it to the string black. And now in the browser, each time we visit the products route, the search parameters will be already included, so we don't have to type them manually, which makes testing search parameters a bit easier. Now, back in VS Code, so far we've been using only strings as values, but we can use any valid JavaScript type as a search parameter. To give you an example, we could turn the string into an array and add another color like gray. Now save the changes, and in the browser, let's revisit the products route to load the updated search object, and notice how it turns the search parameters into a valid query string. And this goes both ways. the query string is also parsed back into a JavaScript object with the correct types. And we didn't have to do anything manually. TanStack Router does all of this for us. So right now the user can enter any value for the search parameter and the application will just accept it. So take query for example. A search query is usually a string, but I could just as easily pass a boolean like true. And now in the browser, if I revisit the products route, we can see that the application will just accept it. So we need a way to make sure the search parameters are valid before the application uses them. And for that, we need to install a validation library. So some examples are Zot, Valibot, or Effect, and you can use any of them. However, Zot works really well with TanStack Router, which is why we'll use it in this course. So how does validation work in Zot? Well, basically everything starts with a schema, and a schema is just a description of what your data is supposed to look like. And this can be a simple primitive like a string or a boolean, but it can also be a nested object, and the object can have other properties, each with their own schema. And once we have a schema set up, we can then use it to validate any data against it. Now, to get started with Zot, we need to install it first. So in VS Code, let's open the terminal and run npm I Zot. And once that's done, we'll open the products route. And at the top, we import Z from Zot. So now we should create a Zot schema to define the shape of the expected search parameters. And in this case, the search parameters are stored in an object. So we'll start by creating an object schema using Zot's object function. And this creates a Zot schema that will check whether the data we're validating is an object. Now, next we need to validate the properties inside the object. And to do that, we pass it an object literal. And inside it, we can then specify the keys of the search parameters. So first of all, we have a search parameter with the key query. It should be a string. So we set it to a string schema using Zot's string function. And this returns a string schema that makes sure the value of query is a string. So essentially, we're defining a schema for an object, and inside it, we're using other schemas for its properties. So each property is validated according to its schema. All right, now, next we have a search parameter with the key color, and this should be an array. So we set it to an array schema using Zot's array function. Now, inside the parentheses, we should also specify the type of the values in the array, and each value should be a string. So we pass it a string schema using Zot's string function. And this will make sure the color is an array with strings as values. However, this is not strict enough because it can accept any string as value. And usually we want to only allow certain colors. So instead of the string function, we will use the enum function, which will then pass an array of only the allowed values. For example, black, gray, and white. And with that, we created our schema. And what it does is, it first makes sure the data is an object. Then it checks whether the value of query is a string. And finally, it checks whether color is an array with only black, gray, or white. All right, so let's store it in a constant called schema. And now we should use the schema to validate our search parameters. And to do that, in the route options, we will use a property called validate search. And we simply set it to schema. And now if the search object matches the schema, it will return the validated search object. And if it doesn't, it will throw an error with what exactly went wrong. All right, now, besides validating the data, TypeScript will also warn us if we try to use the search parameters incorrectly. For example, in Portal menu, we now get a TypeScript error because we entered the Boolean instead of a string. And also in the browser, it throws an error telling us what went wrong. And it basically says that it expects a string and not a Boolean. Alright, so in VS Code, let's use a string instead. And we'll just go for keyboard again. Alright, that will get rid of the TypeScript error. And also in the browser, when we revisit the products route, the error should go away. So by validating our search parameters, we now have type safety, and it prevents the user from entering wrong values. Alright, now let's look at another example. So back in VS Code, let's say for the query, the user enters keyboard, but accidentally adds a space after it. Then the space will also be included in the query. So in the browser, if we navigate to the products route, you'll notice the extra space is still there. And it's best to remove any extra spaces from the query before we use it. And that's also something we can use Zod for. So back in VS Code, let's open the products route. And for our query parameter, we'll call a method on the string schema called trim. And this removes any white space at the beginning and end of the string value. So let's check it in the browser. Let's revisit the products route, and you'll see that the query no longer has the extra space. Alright, now notice that the products link is not marked as active anymore, and that's because in VS Code, inside Portal menu, we added a query with a space at the end. So the router expects that exact query, but since we trim it at runtime, it sees a different URL and doesn't mark the link as active. So that's normal. You can just ignore it for now. This won't be an issue when everything is set up. So in the previous lesson, we've added a search object to the nav link, which was actually just for testing. So let's comment it out. And suddenly we get an error saying that the search property is missing. And that's because by default, when you use a Zod schema, then it requires you to pass a value. And right now, all the search parameters are undefined, so we should provide them with default values. So in the products route, after the trim method, we call another method called default. And in the parentheses, we can pass it a default value for when it's undefined. So let's just pass it an empty string. So if the user doesn't enter a query, the value will be an empty string by default. Alright, now let's do the same for color. And here we'll use an empty array as the default value. And with that, the error in Portal menu should be gone. And in the browser, if we revisit the products route, the search parameters should use a default value. For this lesson, let's uncomment the search object again. Alright, now as we saw earlier, whenever we try to enter a wrong value, for example, instead of a string, a number like 1, 2, 3, we will get a TypeScript error. But also in the browser, if we revisit the products route, it will throw an error. Now, usually we don't want to stop the user from using the app just because of a wrong search parameter. This is considered bad practice. So in VS Code, let's open the products route, and after the default method, we can call a method called catch. And this will catch any error when a wrong value is entered, and it will replace it with whatever we pass in the parentheses. So let's just pass it an empty string. Now in the browser, if you revisit the products route, we won't get an error anymore because the number we entered is replaced with an empty string. And this is much more user-friendly than just throwing an error. Alright, now back in VS Code, for the color, we're only allowed to use black, gray, or white. So import a menu. Let's try entering a wrong value, and instead of gray, enter orange. Now in the browser, if you revisit the products route, we should get an error because orange is not a valid value. Again, just showing an error like that is something we want to avoid. So back in VS Code, let's open the products route, and for the color, next to the default method, we'll call the catch method, and we pass it an empty array as the fallback value. Now save the changes, and in the browser, if we revisit the products route, we won't get an error anymore because the color is replaced with an empty array. So that's how you can handle errors using Zot. Now there's one more thing that's really useful. So back in VS Code, we can add .coerce in front of the string schema, which basically converts the input into the expected type before the schema validates it. So if it's a number, a boolean, or anything else, it will be converted to a string. So let's check it in the browser. Let's revisit the products route, and you'll notice that the number is converted to a string. So we keep the user's query instead of throwing it away. Alright, and that's it for this lesson. So in VS Code, import a menu. We can now set query back to the string keyboard and orange to gray. Now let's say we want to check whether the products we're filtering are in stock. For that, we can use a new search parameter called in stock, and it should take a boolean value such as true. Alright, now to get rid of the error, we should define it in our schema. So in the products route, we'll add a new property to the schema called in stock. And it should be a boolean, so we set it to a boolean schema by using Zot's boolean function. And right now it only gives us two states. If the value is true, we show products that are in stock, and if it's false, we show products that aren't in stock. But what we're missing is a third option where we don't filter at all and just show all products. And in that case, we just don't want to use the search parameter. However, import a menu, if we leave out the in stock property, it results in an error saying that the in stock property is missing. And also in the browser, we'll see an error saying it expected a boolean but received undefined. And this is because every property in the schema is required by default. So what we need to do is make it optional and allow it to be undefined. So in VS Code, let's open the products route, and on the boolean schema, we'll just call the optional method. And now if you look in the portal menu, the error should be gone, and also in the browser, if we revisit the products route, we don't get an error anymore. Alright, now to finish this lesson, we should also catch any errors in case a wrong value is entered. So back in VS Code, let's open the products route, and next to the optional method, we'll call the catch method, and it should fall back to undefined. And we won't use the default method here because the default method fills in missing values. So all it really does is replace undefined with something else. And here undefined is allowed, so it doesn't make sense to use the default method here. Now let's open the portal menu, and before anything else, bring back the in stock property. Alright, now imagine we want to filter the products by price and only show those with a minimum price of 100. Then we can add a search parameter called min price and set it to 100. Now let's say we also want to set a maximum price. Then we can add another search parameter called max price and set it to, for example, 500. All right, now these two search parameters are supposed to give us products priced between 100 and 500. And since these values are related, we can also combine them into a single object. So instead of passing them separately, we can use a search parameter called price range and set it to an object with min price set to 100 and max price set to 500. And this way the values are grouped, which makes them easier to work with. Now we still get a TypeScript error because we're using a property that does not exist in our schema. So let's open the products route, and next to in stock, we'll add a property called price range, and it should be an object, so we set it to an object schema using Zot's object function. Now to define the shape of the object, we pass a pair of curly braces, and inside we should have a property called min price, which is a number, so we set it to a number schema using Zot's number function. Next, we also have the max price property, which we also set to a number schema. All right, save the changes, and the TypeScript error important menu should be gone. And in the browser, if we revisit the products route, it will show us all the search parameters, including the price range object. Now in VS Code, if we comment out price range, it will result in a TypeScript error saying price range is missing. So we should also set some default values for when no value is entered. So in the products route, on the price range object, we call the default method. And by default, price range is an object with min price set to 1 and max price set to 1000. All right, now save the changes, and in the browser, if we revisit the products route, it should show us the default price range object. Now we still need to make sure the numbers that are entered are valid. For example, the user shouldn't be able to enter a number smaller than 1. So back in VS Code, starting with min price, we call the min method on the number schema, and here we just pass a minimum allowed value, in this case 1. So let's test it. Import the menu. Let's first uncomment the price range property and then enter a min price smaller than 1, like 0. And now in the browser, if we revisit the products route, it should throw an error saying the number is too small. So let's catch the error. In VS Code, open the products route, and next to the min method, we call the catch method, which falls back to 1 in case of an error. All right, now in the browser, if we revisit the products route, it won't throw an error anymore because min price is set to 1. Now let's also validate max price. So back in VS Code, and for max price, it should have a minimum value of 1, and it should also have a maximum allowed value. And for that, we use the max method and set it to 1000. So the user can't enter a number smaller than 1 or bigger than 1000. So let's test it. Import a menu. For max price, we'll enter a value bigger than 1000, like 1001. Now save the changes and open the browser. Let's revisit the products route, and it should throw an error saying the number is too big. So let's catch the error in VS Code. Open the products route, and next to max, we'll call the catch method, so it falls back to 1000. And now in the browser, if we revisit the products route, the error should be gone because max price is set to 1000. As you have noticed, we didn't specify a maximum allowed value for the min price. But we still need some validation here. However, this one is different because here we want to make sure that it never goes above max price. However, max price is something that can vary every time depending on what the user enters. So we can't just use the max method for that. So what we'll do is, next to the default method, we'll call another method on the object schema called transform. Now let me first save the changes to reformat the file. All right, now what the transform function does is, it takes the user input and allows us to change it into a different form before returning it. To do that, we pass it a function as an argument, which receives the price range object with whatever the user entered. And then we just return a new object with any changes we want to make. So the first property we want to include is min price, and we set it to the math.min function, and this function basically takes in multiple numbers and returns the smallest one. So from the price range object, we take min price. Next, from the price range object, we'll also take max price. Now let's first save the changes to reformat the file. All right, so this function takes the smaller value between the two and uses that as min price. And this way, min price will never be bigger than max price. Now keep in mind, this will override everything in the price range object, so make sure to also include max price in the returned object, and then just set it to price range dot max price, just so we don't lose the value. All right, now let's test it. So in portal menu, we'll set max price to 1000 and the min price to something higher, for example 1100. So what will happen is, the math.min function will take the smaller value between 1000 and 100 and 1000 and then use that as the min price. So let's check it in the browser. Let's revisit the products route and notice that min price is set to 1000 instead. And this ensures that min price is never bigger than max price. Now in VS Code, let's set max price to something else like 800. And then in the browser, revisit the products route, and now min price is set to 800. So min price is validated dynamically depending on what the max price is. Now back in VS Code, let's set min price to something smaller, like 300. And in the browser, revisit the products route, and this time 300 is smaller than 800, so it uses the original value. All right, I'm sure you get the point. Now, before we move on to the next lesson, in VS Code, let's open the products route and clean up the code by destructuring the price range object and extracting min price and max price. So we can remove the price range prefix. Now in the portal menu file, let's comment out the search object. Then in the browser, revisit the products route, and it should load with all the default values. However, with all the default search parameters in the query string, the URL looks a bit messy. So in this lesson, we're going to see how we can hide default search parameters from the URL. So in VS Code, let's open the products route, and below the schema, we'll create a constant called default values and set it to an object. And inside it, we can define all the default values for our search parameters. And right now we can type anything here, so we need to make it type safe first. So above the default values object, we use zots infer utility, and inside angle brackets, we pass the schema type using type of schema. And this then infers the types for all the properties in the schema. So we'll store it in a type called schema type. And finally, we define the type of default values with a colon followed by schema type. And by annotating the type, we make sure the object matches the schema. All right, so the first search parameter is query, and its default value is an empty string. Next is color, which defaults to an empty array. And finally, we have price, range, and its default value is an object with min price set to 1 and max price set to 1000. All right, next in the route options, we'll use the search property. We set it to an object, and inside we use the middleware's property, which we set to an array. And here we can define all the functions that should run before the route uses the search parameters. Now, to strip default values from the URL, at the top, next to create file route, we'll import strip search params, which is a function we can use to hide certain search parameters. So in the array, we'll add the strip search params function, and we just pass it default values, so it will hide the default values from the URL. And with that, we're done here, so we can close the products route. All right, now let's open the browser, revisit the products route, and the default values are now hidden from the URL, and only values that differ from the default values will be shown.